Nader stretched, then slowly flopped back against the headboard of his bed. He had hardly slept a wink, and he was reluctant to leave the comfort of his bed. The responsibilities of the day were doing little to increase his motivation, one responsibility more than others. A faint tremor in the ground, barely the lightest of vibrations, was a reminder to Nader that he didn't have much choice in the matter, though. It was a sensation most wouldn't have even noticed. Nader only recognized it because he knew what to look for. He had experienced it before. It was the source of his work for the day. With a great amount of effort, Nader forced himself out of the safety of his linens and to his feet. He prepared a simple breakfast of eggs and toast and a large mug of coffee, and then sat on his balcony overlooking the city. It was early in the morning, and the city was just starting to stir to life. A small trickle of cars on the streets marked the beginning of the commute to work for many, or return journeys for those who had finished night shifts. A few other people in the apartment building were also enjoying breakfasts out on their balconies. They didn't know what was awaiting them. But Nader knew. He had seen it happen over and over again. He had lived through it over and over again. The eruption came like clockwork for Nader. In only a few hours, the faint tremors he was noticing would become much more significant. Not long after, the volcano nobody had known was there would explode and the city would be engulfed in a pyroclastic flow. It couldn't be stopped. It was inevitable. At least, for the time being. It was part of Nader's job to buy them time. Not that he needed to rush. He had plenty of time to get to the office and set off the time warp. He'd felt more urgency at first, but this was his 10th warp. He knew the routine. He would finish his breakfast, he would shower and dress for work, and then he would head into the office. Once he was there, he would head past the volcanologists and physicists entering their exclusion pods, and he would do his part of the activation sequence before entering his own. Like clockwork. It was exhausting, if he was honest. But it was the only option to protect the city. They couldn't evacuate everyone. They had tried that before. Only a third of the residents survived. All they could do was keep pressing the reset button to give the volcanologists more time to figure out how to prevent the eruption, or at least significantly reduce the damage it caused. Nader was starting to wonder if such a solution really existed. They had conquered time itself, or at the very least, they had enough mastery of it for a short jump backwards, but they were about to jump for the 10th time and they still couldn't sate the bloodlust of the Earth itself. It was as if the planet was determined for the city to die. Nader wished that the cycle would finally end. He had hoped they could jump forward instead, but traveling to a destination that doesn't exist yet had proved impossible. All they could do was keep repeating themselves, all but a few of them unaware that such a thing was even occurring. They were surviving on borrowed time. The more Nader thought about it, the more tired he felt, the more hopeless it seemed. Perhaps some things were just meant to happen. He felt a stronger tremor through the floor. It was still faint, but this time it was strong enough that the others could notice. In fact, he noticed some of his neighbors on their own balconies glancing around nervously. It was about time for him to finish getting ready and head into work to prepare the next jump. Half an hour later, Nader was in the driver's seat of his car, one of many crawling along the highway. Even knowing he would make it to where he had to go, the glacial speed of the morning traffic was mildly annoying. It was annoying every time. As he always did, Nader eventually escaped the highway and found himself pulling into a parking space at the office. At least, that's what they called it. In reality, while it looked like an ordinary office building from outside, inside it was more of a laboratory. He turned off his vehicle and sat there for several minutes. There was work to be done, but every loop it took more and more effort to exit his car and set about his tasks. It seemed counterintuitive to him when he thought about it. His innate self-preservation and his desire to help those who were otherwise doomed should have easily provided enough motivation to make his way inside every morning. Instead, every cycle he just felt more and more worn down. They were making no progress. Nothing they had tried had worked, and most of the things they had yet to try still would take hundreds more loops to achieve. Even then, they weren't likely to work either. Nader reached for the handle of his door and found his hand frozen before it reached it. maybe it was time to accept that some things couldn't be changed. The endless looping couldn't just be affecting his own mentality. Surely everyone else was also coming to the same hopeless realization as he had. They were playing God, but they were losing the game. They would always lose the game. The only way not to lose was to stop playing. Nader turned the engine back on and pulled away from the car park. They likely wouldn't be able to make the jump work without him. It took a lot of work from the whole team. He should have felt guilty, but he only felt free.
Hello, and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we talk about stories told across a wide array of different mediums: books, movies, games, comics, all that good stuff. However, we have one rule. We can only discuss things in terms of the writing. Anything like acting, art, animation, what have you, all of that is out unless it directly relates to how the story is being told. I am Daniel Radford, author, desperate scientist, and also your host. And today I'm joined once more by John Kernan, the owner of the voice you just heard reading a story.
Yep, and don't worry, I got out. I'm not caught in a loop.
That's what he thinks.
Oh no.
So as we wrap up our cycle on time travel, we'll be closing things out by taking a look at City of Cycles, the short story that you just heard. I suppose since I wrote the story, I may as well go a little bit into why I chose to write it, and just my general thoughts on it, and we can probably take it from there.
I would hope you have some thoughts and opinions on it.
You would hope. So I chose to do a looping story because, as we've already established, it's my favorite kind of time travel story. I wanted to do a little bit different since we went a lot in depth into like some of the stuff with Higurashi and ReZero, and even to an extent with Predestination we went into a bit. I wanted to really lean into the apathy side of things rather than like focusing on the metaphorical stuff.
Short stories aren't as good as that kind of thing, at that kind of thing, anyways. Unless you've got a very specific thing you're going for. I mean, some short stories can be pretty heavy with metaphor, but I don't know. I think the shorter a story is, the easier it is for it to get lost in the weeds and stuff like metaphors.
It depends like how like poetic you want to go with it. To be fair as well,
Y-
like you
Yeah,
can
I guess
go.
that's fair. You have to be much more abstract if you want to make more metaphors in less time.
Yeah, I don't usually have a very poetic writing style. I'm pretty straight to the point because, like, I want my stuff to be as accessible and relatable to as many people as possible. Like, I make a
Yeah.
point of that. We've talked about that a little bit when we talked about Domino. So even when I do poetry, I try to keep it not too flowery because I want people to actually understand it. So this was a
Yeah,
pretty
exactly.
straightforward story, a much more like just straightforward take on it, just leading into the how much it sucks.
Yeah, I guess that's what it is, right? Like if you want to do metaphor in like a longer running story, I mean, every story is going to have metaphors and there's little philosophical things. But in a longer story, for the most part, they're much more suited to subtext. Whereas if you want to make them clear in less time, a lot of times they kind of just need to be the text. And if that's not the kind of thing you're there to write, then that's just not going to work that way.
Yeah, there was a little thing in implied in City of Cycles that you have to think about, I guess, to see if you catch, which I suppose we'll get into that a little bit. But just as a side note, really hard to write time travel stories, guys. I know we covered this in like the very first episode of the season,
But
but
now he's done it.
it is a fucking nightmare to try and figure out how you want to do it and justify certain things.
Yeah.
So I'm not gonna lie. Part of the reason I chose looping is because it is one of the easiest to figure out how that works as a timeline because it's just a circle.
Yeah. Like the only thing you really have to do to justify is how was the loop created and why is person in the loop?
In this case, you don't know how it was created because I didn't tell you. But
I guess you could say it's a good thing he's in on the secret because they really want to keep him in the loop.
Hey, uh, yeah, I done a little bit about the actual mechanics of the how the time travel was supposed to work. I alluded to that a little bit. I didn't want to go obviously too deep into that stuff for a short story. I didn't want to start reading like an instruction manual. Uh, but essentially, the one major rule is you can't time travel forward. That would have been very convenient to just yeet the city to after the eruption's already happened and everyone could be safe. But as they found out, you can't go to a place that doesn't exist yet.
Oh man. Good thing, anyways. I mean, what would happen with any potential survivors of the incident?
Good question.
I mean, just imagine if they jumped forward and the city tried to appear in the
It just crushed them.
yeah, it tried to appear in the place of its own ruins, or there was just some small enclave of survivors that was like just in a good enough position that they were ready to like try to get out of the city, go somewhere better, or help was on the way, only like to be like, oh, cool, an entirely new reality shifting over here. Oh, I'm sorry. How many? 20 different people have doppelgangers now.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. You can tell like they're desperate, so they've not really thought of the consequences for any of this. Which honestly,
No,
maybe
they've
I should
reached
have
a
gone.
point of just like,
Maybe I should have gone
gotta
into
stop
that.
it.
Maybe I would have if I'd given myself more time and more space to do it, but obviously I didn't.
No, and you would have had to have a completely different tone because like this is this has ironically gotten us to a point of something that really only loops can offer you when it comes to time travel stories. There's one thing I don't think any other kind of time travel story can, at least generally, cover well and be believable with a loop. It's mundanity.
Yeah, it's monotonous as hell to do the same thing, exactly the same thing, over and over and over and over, and it kills you after a while because like maybe it doesn't actually kill you, although I guess effectively you could argue it might have for NATO. But I mean, think of how it sucks, how much you hate to repeat the same task over and over again.
Yeah,
Always get it.
especially when you're doing it like specifically because like in the hopes that something is supposed to change and then it just doesn't.
I mean, it's the definition of insanity. Doing the
It's
same thing over
literally
and
what I
over.
was about to say. As soon as we think about the monotonous side of that, my brain goes straight to Far Cry 3 and I see Mr. Vas Montenegro himself right in front of me just going, "I ever told you the definition of insanity?"
And yeah, I mean, maybe our boy Nader actually kind of caught on to that a little bit. You could kind of get a hint with that with some of the wording used toward the end there, where he sort of realized that, uh, when you're playing God, you can't win that game. Like, it's not gonna go well for you.
Yeah,
There is a limit, and nature is always going to win.
one could argue he chose he chose sanity and also chose the future because what if that what if that was never going to work? What if nothing was ever actually going to change?
Well, exactly. I mean, he was of the opinion that chances were things wouldn't. It's like he said. This was only his 10th loop, and he was already starting to crack. But he alluded to the fact that they have plans in place. They've tried a bunch of things that just didn't work, and they have plans in place. But to get those plans to work, it's going to take them hundreds of loops and even then, even if everything works completely as intended, it may still not deal with the problem.
Yep. It's it's a sad thought and to be honest, I'm sure an alternate world where they do actually try something like jumping forward like you mentioned, that's just when we get the new when it finally works, we get the new Final Destination movie. Easy.
I
Look
mean,
at this very big and very specific list of people who were supposed to die.
yeah, I mean, time traveling forward has always irked me as a concept because the future is such a nebulous thing. It's not set in stone. It could be anything.
Yeah, if there's anything that makes me think about quantum mechanics, actually, it's the future. Because, like, the future doesn't feel. The past is something that happened. The present is what's happening right now. But a lot of times the future feels less like something that is going to happen and more like something we create, whether intentional or not.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the future is nothing but the end result of a series of actions. And depending on the actions you take in the present, it could be any number of different things. And depending on uh, how accurate certain quantum theories are, every possible future will happen in some timeline, in some capacity.
So how do you know which one you're going to go to? And if we create the future, what kind of future are you going to create by trying to skip everything in between?
Exactly. And it's like you said, like the simplest problem that could have happened from this is just that they teleport the city through time and drop it on top of the remains of another city, basically. Like that, they could just wipe out the survivors effectively. And then what if there's survivors from that event, and you do have a bunch of people who exist simultaneously twice in the same timeline? A lot of people, a lot of media comes to the conclusion that you can never meet yourself in another timeline because you'll just destroy everything.
Yeah, and if there's tens of people with that problem all at the same time who are in the same area because you haven't jumped forward far enough for it to be a different place.
Even if that doesn't happen, right? Even if meeting your doppelganger wouldn't end the world, it's still gonna fuck with your head. Like there's this Netflix show. It's a short one. It's called Katla, right? It's not a time travel show, but it's set in I think it's Iceland, might be Greenland, whatever. It's set near the Katla volcano, and a bunch of doppelgangers basically get spat out of the volcano, and it messes with people's lives because like who's real, what's real, who gets to live in the scenario now, and a bunch of other
Yeah,
stuff like effectively with a time travel doppelganger situation, you get the same thing. Like, which one of you gets the right to live then? Like, do you both get to live? Who's the real one? You have the same
who's
face,
allowed to
the same
continue just living
experiences.
the life you've been living and who has to leave to try to become essentially a different person?
Yeah. So they
Because
definitely haven't considered the possible, like the consequences of what happens if they succeed. They're just
yeah,
focused on surviving, which is definitely an interesting angle that you don't see a lot with time travel stories, really, honestly.
it, it's a funny angle too because you think one of the interesting takes on something like that, right, is if two of the same person exist. Logically, it seems like even if you don't believe in some of the timey-wimey type stuff, that one of them has to change because if you don't go on the principles of time travel we've theorized so far, then it seems like it would go to a much more basic principle of physics, and that's that two people who, if they are both the same person and ostensibly want and will likely do the same things, two objects can't occupy the same space.
I mean, things get kind of weird with quantum mechanics, so if
Yeah, I just
things
mean,
things can be in two places at the same time, and so, but
but not two different things that can perceive each other.
don't know. No one's ever tried, but
Huh. Hey,
good
hopefully.
probably.
I, I really hope someone hasn't been trying this whole time and we just didn't know.
uh, but yeah, it's exactly like, and like the thing is as well. We know for a fact that if they try evacuating, there are survivors in this scenario. The story, as I wrote it, confirms that a third of the people in the city will survive if they evacuate.
Yeah, plus whoever heard of a disaster with no survivors? like on any significant scale, I
Yeah,
should say.
yeah, exactly. Like the larger a scale something is, well, it's kind of weird. It's less like a upward diagram, right? And it's more like a, oh god, what's the word? A quadratic shape.
Yeah,
Because there's a point in the middle between really small scale and really large scale, where it's large enough that it's affecting like thousands, hundreds, or even or thousands of people. That you're gonna get survivors probably. Even Pompeii had survivors, I'm pretty sure. The
yeah,
people who
no,
evacuated. But once you get to a high enough scale, you circle back around to no survivors because that's like planetary like extinction level.
yeah. I would. The only thing I would say about that, it's like that describing it as a middle area can be slightly misleading because it is a middle area, but also like that middle area is bigger than a lot of people would think.
Yeah,
Like
it's
it,
the middle area between rogue gunmen and another planet collides with us.
yeah, like if you want to expect any kind of disaster to actually wipe an area off the face of the earth with no survivors, it needs to be of a scale where the line between something being capable of that and actually fucking with the entire planet at once, like screwing up our atmosphere or something like that, actually gets pretty thin.
Yeah. And yeah, this one volcanic eruption, it's not a super volcano. It's just a regular ass volcano. Isn't at that scale. It's people are gonna survive.
It's a natural disaster.
Here's the thing about that though. So Nader's basically accepted death, right?
Yeah, he's tired.
But he's exhausted. But there is something in the story that I've left kind of open ended, which is something that I think is interesting to think about, and also horrifying. How many times has he had his 10th loop?
That's true.
He doesn't think that they are likely to like set it all off without him, but there are other physicists there,
Yeah.
and they're gonna get even. And if they've succeeded once, they can do it again and again. So
How does he know there aren't times that he just wasn't even aware he looped because he wasn't there?
exactly. They have these exclusion pods, and the only reason you remember that you looped is if you were excluded in some way on these pods. If Nader stops getting into that exclusion pod, and he just accepts death, he could still be looping and just not know it.
Yeah, especially because despite the fact that he has every reason to believe he's very important to the project, if he thought about it a little more and he wasn't so tired, he would probably realize it would make no sense for any one person to be completely vital to a project like this. If you do something like that, it's pretty much doomed from the start. You can't have something like this work if any one piece can fall off and it doesn't come together anymore.
Exactly. I mean, there's a lot of hubris. Like for such a short story, there's a lot of hubris present in it. Uh, just even at the scale of fucking with time the way they are to begin with. And there's a note.
Well,
They
I'm
really
sure
have
he had
tried to
to.
jump forward because they know it doesn't work.
That's true, and it's kind of funny because I almost want to call it false hubris. It's false hubris that became tired hubris because I'm sure the reason he has that is simply because he reached a point a while ago where if he wanted to keep going and he wanted to keep trying this, he had to tell himself it wouldn't work without him. He had to convince himself he had to keep going, otherwise he was gonna quit sooner than this.
Yep. That is true. Honestly, I hadn't even really thought of that. It just came naturally with the character, I suppose.
But yeah, but it's something you think about when somebody's like, because what's the reason you get up and keep doing something when it stops feeling good? It doesn't really feel like you're accomplishing anything, and you're frustrating and tired. There's only two reasons. You hope something's going to change, and you tell yourself you have to.
Yep.
You have to do it. Like, sorry, it sucks. Get up. You have to do it. That's what you tell yourself until you can't anymore.
Look, I'm not one of these people who like talks about characters like they have free will, right? A character doesn't do anything on the page that you don't make them do.
Of
But
course.
when you analyze them later on, you're always going to see things that make sense that you never even thought of because you don't factor it in. It just happens naturally as part of the process and just logically is a part of the character, whether you intend it to be or not. And
Yeah,
this
that's
is
one of the
those
things I love
situations.
about writing. Like characters characters are close enough to being living, breathing people that some of that stuff is unconscious and it's I say it's one of the parts that creates the idea of death of the author, except unlike other stuff involved in death of the author, that aspect is always there, whether the author is still involved or not. And that's that like characters are going to develop at least certain traits, certain motivations, reasons for what they do simply because they make sense. And the author does not have to actively think of them and intentionally have designed that part consciously for it to still be true because it makes sense. You look at it and the logical part of your brain goes, "Oh yeah, any person would feel this in this situation or have this reason for doing something."
Yeah, and like I didn't think about it that much with Nader, obviously. Like I just said, it just happened that it went out this way. But I very much wrote this story with that sort of idea in mind. That if I put the building blocks there, a reader would be able to construct the rest of the reality from that. And because there's logical connections to make, most people are going to probably come to the same conclusions that you have and that I have on like reading it back.
Yeah.
Which I think is like just a good writing thing to remember in general. You don't have to fill out every single building block of a world and a storyline because there are certain logical conclusions that people are just going to make. Like, how long has Nader been doing this really is just a thing that you think about eventually. Because that's the nature of a time loop. Why is he still doing that is just going to be baked into the character because you think about it, because why is he still doing it this long if he doesn't think it's going to work?
Yeah. And and something
Let's
else I
watch that
appreciate
clip.
about this is the way you set it up. Nader as a person has also gone through a loop, which helps explain where he's got to mentally. He's gone from going to work to make the world a better place to going to work to, in a small scale sense at least, save the world to really even just getting up in the morning to save the world, right back to actually just going to work, not wanting
Yeah.
to get up in the morning, struggling to eat breakfast, and then literally sitting in his car for multiple minutes just trying to get the willpower to actually get up and go in the office.
Monotony is like that. It's insidious. And that's the danger of a time loop. It's the same thing as like you start a job you love, and then you do that same job for, you know, 2, 3, 10, 20 years, and it starts becoming a chore regardless. Like I love writing, but like I have some days where I get up and I'm like, Christ, I gotta do this again.
Stagnancy is a terrifying thing. If you're not convinced that something's going to change, something's going to be different, motivation becomes exponentially harder.
For sure. And again, and the less you feel like you're going to achieve something, the harder and harder that gets. Especially when you're repeating that same task over and over. It's why a lot of people who are doing like something competitive, for example, they eventually give it up. You know? Because it's not because they physically can't anymore, it's because they realize that they're never going to break that ceiling Like, they've reached a point where they will not get any further, and it's not because they physically don't have the ability necessarily. It's just because they've been outcompeted.
Yeah, and you can't stay 100% fully motivated into something forever. Like, your motivation is going to wane some days, and once you reach a point where that's happening more often, like, competitive athletics are one of the things, ironically, despite the fact that uh, despite the physical aspect of it, I would say few things require constant motivation more than athletics because every single time you're not doing as much as you're supposed to and have any off day other than like a rest day, you aren't just not making progress, you are losing progress. Every time you're not making progress, it starts draining away from you, which means if you're not going into it all the time, you start slipping. And when you get to a point where that motivation itself starts slipping and you don't feel like you can be into it all the time, it only gets harder and harder until you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? Can you be that person anymore? Because if you can't, you're only hurting yourself by continuing to try.
Yeah, I mean, I've been there. Like, I don't know if I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but before I got into before I made writing like a career choice, I was a competitive dancer for a long time. And you do reach those phases where you're continuing out of sheer stubbornness more than anything. Like, obviously you take a break or you have a small win somewhere or something changes that refreshes you and you start again and it's fine. But you do get to points where it's like you've been practicing this thing for years or months or whatever. Sometimes it only takes days for something to get frustrating, and you're just throwing yourself against a brick wall to try and get it right, and you break your body for your craft.
Yeah,
And it's
and
easy to understand why some people drop out. In the end, I had to because my body gave out before my mind did, and I got sick.
yeah, that both they're mostly unfortunately, and in some very small way for your sanity, fortunately, that choice was made for you before you got there.
I mean, I miss it terribly. I'd still be doing it if I could, but yeah, I mean, it's the same thing.
Absolutely.
It's the same thing with drawing because I do uh, art these days. I often will hit a point where I just can't get something, and you have to step away and break the cycle, otherwise you go mad. And that's what a time loop is. Like, that's the insidious nature of it. We talked about that a bit. We touched on that when we did the Higurashi Rezero episode. Like, we dealt with characters who had done loop after loop after loop. You know, so many in the case of Rico, like that. Something has to change. Something has to break that cycle, or you're going to lose your mind. Like, and in the case of Nada, I mean, yeah, he only got 10 loops in, because he doesn't have that kind of superhuman willpower. He's seen the scope of what he's up against and has realized that he is insignificant.
Well, and also he also doesn't have the time because it's a very tight loop, and he doesn't have a real support system in place because
Oh,
Rika, as awful as what she went through is lucky in at least two ways, and that's that he has some time to live in each loop before it's over, to actually live, and she has people there who love her and care about her to help her do the living part.
yeah, Nada, by design, definitely did not have that. And you can see that. Like, he lives alone. There's no one else in that apartment. And he, the story mentions, like, no one else around him knows this is happening.
Nader's support system is his morning coffee and probably a single little motivational thing he drew on a whiteboard with a gray marker that said, "Get up, do it."
Do it or everyone dies. With a little smiley face.
Yeah, exactly. A little a little smiley face, and not just a regular smiley face, but a smiley face that screams, "Everything is fine."
Yeah, so it's implicit, right, in the story, like, that this is clearly a confidential thing. No one is supposed to know because there'd be panic. And you can tell that because it's a regular office building from the outside.
Yeah, and they're trying to only change very small, specific things because how can you possibly hope for any sort of measured and predictable change to the future if there's more than a couple variables when it's already so hard to predict what's going to happen, especially if you're trying to make it happen? So forget about the possibility of the disaster getting worse or less people getting out alive. The real fear of panic is the second something like panic happens, there's a billion more variables in their attempt to literally solve this disaster like it's a math problem.
And they are very much on a time crunch. Like, the thing is, clearly they were already working on this technology because the eruption comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So they've been working on this, and then suddenly one day they're all in the office, quotation marks, and they feel that rumble. And someone goes, uh-oh. And they just jump back as far as they can. And they have to keep doing that until maybe they can get far enough back that they can bring in these volcanologists. Like, I don't know exactly when that happened. I don't imagine it would have taken that many jumps, probably. I think they were already on the verge of being able to get reasonably far back. You know, they bring in the volcanologist, explain the situation. There's probably a loop in there directly after that where they just have to experience it, the eruption and the loop back, just to convince them it's a thing.
Wouldn't surprise me.
They've probably not got that much time. And again, they're up against a volcano. They're trying to find a way to stop an eruption, or a way to guarantee that everyone gets out alive when the eruption happens.
And humanity hasn't done that yet.
Yeah. I mean, I think there've been small eruptions where there've been no deaths.
Sure. You know, we've managed to tame small hot cuts in the earth.
Yeah.
We have yet to properly tame. Yeah, we have yet to find a way to actively control a screaming, gaping, burning wound in the earth that's determined to make everything around it hurt as much as it does.
Yeah, I imagine this as like a Vesuvius or a Krakatoa situation, where
it's got to be if it's going to destroy like an entire city and kill more than half the population, right?
Probably more than that, even, to be honest. Well, Krakatoa, yeah, Vesuvius, but you know, Krakatoa, when it went off in like the early 1900s, I think, in the late 1800s, even, I think it was an island that blew itself the fuck up. That's what we're looking at here, basically. Like, no one knew that this was a volcano. So it's just been sitting there, building up pressure for centuries. No one had a clue, and then it detonates, basically. So you're not even just looking at the pyroclastic flow and the lava, which, again, the lava is the lesser of the dangers in an eruption. It's that flow of superheated ash that fucks everyone up. But you're also
that literal moment of the earth exploding and popping its top.
You're looking at a sonic wave that is going to shatter glass, and that's going to damage electronics, and that's going to cause injuries and complications. You're looking at the flow of ash itself, which is just gonna murder people instantly.
All things that will simultaneously hurt people and hinder their ability to leave and get to safety at the same time.
You're looking at earthquakes, which start fires and cause buildings to fall down. The
ash itself will probably start a few fires because it'll be so hot.
Fires will start for sure. If you're on the coast or near a lake, because people sometimes forget this, lakes can make tsunamis happen too.
Yeah, it may not be as big as one from the ocean, but it's perfectly possible it could still cause a ton of damage.
I mean, to be fair, like, unless The lake, if there's a lake there, yes, it could. You could end up getting a tsunami in that city, but chances are, if you're probably gonna not get one in the city directly next to the volcano. But that's a problem for other people.
Yeah,
Uh,
someone else can loop to fix that one.
like this is a catastrophically big problem, and they are doing is buying time for these volcanologists to try and figure out a solution. And honestly,
Yeah.
I think they're looking to the wrong place. I think it is more of that hubris, right? That they've gone, surely these genius people who study in this field will eventually, with enough time, be able to figure out a way to stop this. And really, what they should be doing is they should have stuck with the evacuation idea
And just made it better.
and just made it better. That's what they should have done. But I
Maybe
mean,
they could get the evacuation to a point of saving almost everyone instead of less than half.
yeah, exactly. They tried that once and basically went, it's not going to work. But by the same token, they keep trying this other thing, and because they know it's going to take so much longer. It's sometimes the smartest people are not the wisest, and that kind of hubris is just a constant in humanity. And I did want to make sure that was a factor because, really, the evacuation was the correct decision.
Bunch of
Even
nerds in a room have gotten so good at math, they've convinced themselves they can turn this entire problem into a math equation and just solve it.
I mean, without the thing is though, they're solving the wrong equation. Like they're trying to solve a problem with complex equations when really they could do it with fractions.
Well, yeah, and on top of that, like the math equation they're trying to solve is not only labyrinthine, it's alive and flowing and changing. But they are men who live off of math, and they've convinced themselves they can math everything to the point of overthinking past other math. Like they're sitting there trying to solve a problem that only they can solve because they're so good at math. Meanwhile, they could potentially find more success in an equation sitting over the next room that has maybe even twice as many pieces as the equation they're trying to solve, and yet could eventually, in time, be solved by people much, much less intelligent and good at math than they are. You just gotta do it.
Yeah, the people who they should really have in that room is, I mean, yeah, the time people because maybe they need a couple more goes. It's not the volcanologists they need. It's the people who are in charge of studying the flow of traffic.
Yeah. Maybe a couple of like disaster if and evacuation specialists or like one or two really experienced search and rescue people who've coordinated stuff like this before.
Exactly. Uh, the biggest folly in the story isn't specifically natives. It's the idea that this little small amount of mastery over time they've given them has made them masters of nature, when in reality it hasn't. Like it's not going to probably. Like I don't think it's feasible for them to stop this eruption happening.
Time travel is just that. It's time travel. They don't have power over time. They can't control it. They
That's the
can
thing.
move
They've already
they can move through it
evidenced
slightly.
that they have no control over it because they can't go forward.
Yeah. They all they can do is travel slightly. And you can't stop a disaster from happening by simply going from one place to another. Like, yes, you've effectively given yourself more time to solve the problem, but that doesn't mean you can solve the problem by just making it not a problem at all instead of finding a way to make it better.
Yeah, I mean but that is all like that is the human instinct, right? I mean, I'm like that. I am. No wonder I wrote the story like this because God knows I see a problem, or I hear about a problem, And my immediate instinct is always, how can I solve this or fix this and stop it being a problem?
How make not happen.
Yeah, like, you know the situation, right? You have a friend come to you and they're really upset about a situation or whatever, and, what they want isn't you to solve, they don't want you to solve the problem. They just want you to help them process it and make them feel better. But just because of the way my brain works, and I think the way most people's brain works to some degree, is we go, well, here's how you could fix this. And that's not what they want from you.
Especially when the solution seems obvious, and you say it thinking that if it's a problem, they must not have done the obvious solution. They just look at you and go, "Ah, geez, thanks. I hadn't thought of that. I feel so much better now."
Yeah, exactly. And it's a common thing. Like, it's what we. It doesn't matter what the scale is. Our immediate reaction to things is consistently either ignore it and hope it goes away, or make it go away. It's never, how do I work with the circumstances?
Yeah, and it's not feasible to always do things that way.
I mean, like, some problems you have to solve, obviously.
Yeah.
Like, they should absolutely be trying to save lives. We're not saying, and the story's not saying either, that they're wrong to want to save people.
But maybe they shouldn't be putting everything they have into some all or nothing solution where we're not even sure if all is a possible outcome.
Yeah, it's basically it's that scenario where so someone says, X bad thing happened to me, and you go, right, here's how you could fix it, and they go, I tried that, it didn't work, and you go, well, obvious, and your first thought was, well, you can do.
You must have done it wrong.
Yeah, exactly. It's that scenario, but on a much more bigger and important scale, and it is that combined with this hubris and this folly in thinking that they can win against nature itself and time itself. It's very human, but it's not actually going to solve the problem, and that's probably contributing, I think, to Nader's sense of apathy and depression in the long run, is that he's starting to realize this when the other people in the room haven't. Not that he knows of anyway.
But unfortunately, he's realized it in a way that's led him to give up because he's already fallen too far into apathy instead of trying to think of something like convincing everybody to try other stuff like what we mentioned.
Yeah, well,
he's just kind of ready to toss the whole thing aside.
Because he's in this analogy, he's the person who's had a bad thing happen to him, but he doesn't even have a person he can talk to who can be a support network. He has the people trying to solve the problem.
And yet he's both in the position of having seen through the trap and very firmly being one of the people who created and was in the trap to begin with, because he's one of those mathematicians with the hubris who was going to solve the big equation. Yeah. And now he's torn down with still having that in him. Which I think is what's stopping him from seeing an alternate solution instead of just saying, oh, this one's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely got flaws. He's one of these people who's caught up in the thing, and he's
as trapped mentally as he is physically.
Exactly, and the thing is, because he's given up, he may well be trapped, quotation marks, forever and just not know it.
Yeah, because what if this isn't even the first time he's given up?
Exactly, it's not even occurred to him that he could have done this before, and he's just looping back and going back to that office and getting in the car.
Because he's convinced that if he had already quit, it would have already fallen apart because they can't do it without him. And
is that arrogant?
He doesn't know that.
And the saddest thing about Nader is he's right. He has to break the cycle. Because again, looping stories are always about escape. always, without fail, are about escape in some way.
Humanity cannot conceivably handle going through the exact same experiences over and over again. You want to forget about the definition of insanity. If there's one thing monotony and on that level, stagnancy definitely is. It doesn't have to be the definition of insanity because it's the birth of insanity. Insanity will always follow.
Yeah, exactly. And he is right again that escape is the solution. He has to break the cycle. But the mistake he's made is that his version of escape is just giving into the loop and, in effect, trapping himself in it with no control. When
instead he could be changing everybody's minds and trying to get everybody to escape.
Exactly. And if this was like a TV series or a movie or something, that would probably be the way the story had to go, right? Someone would eventually, it would be about breaking the cycle and convincing people, you can't stop this, get everyone out, we were right the first time.
Yep, but Nader, he doesn't have anybody around to talk to him about that, and he's too tired and too far gone to have the idea all by himself. So the only way he can think of to break the cycle is to give up on it.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same fallacy as well, right? Like, they've gotten so invested in this idea of buying time until they can find a solution to the volcano.
How could they do anything else?
Exactly. But the saddest thing about it, right, is that they've already proven they could discard the idea because they did it when they discarded the idea of evacuation. It's that
they have the time to make a decision and make a change. If there's one thing they succeeded at, it's giving themselves time, and they can't see the real level of opportunity that affords them.
Yep. I mean, I'm nothing if not consistent in that I wanted the story to be tragic and sad, but I didn't want it to be in the normal way, I wanted to lean into that insidious nature of the loop and really exemplify stagnancy and as the problem and the hubris of it as the problem, and all these very human things despite the sort of fantastical sci-fi nature of the idea of the time loop anyway. Because that's my favorite thing about time loops. That's why I like them so much compared to other time travel varieties. Is because, I think we said this as well the other week, they are so much more human in nature, in the kind of stories they allow you to explore.
It's the only kind of time travel you can look at, and even though it's not physically possible yet as far as we know, look at it and go, oh, that's real. I've lived through that. I've felt that in real life before.
Exactly.
I've woken up in the morning and gone, all right, great, time for the exact same day again.
Yeah, like it's like show of hands. How many people have woken up having to go to like school or work or university or any number of other commitments that they were excited about at first, happy about at first? How many of us have woken up and gone, do I have to?
Literally everyone?
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah. Can't I just like go back to sleep or play video games instead? No, I need to survive. I need to eat. Off I go.
I'm a shark, not a human. If I stop moving, I'll die. Alright.
That's just such a good analogy. Is that, if we stop moving, we die. It's so true. And, yeah, I guess that's I know we've said it several times throughout all this because we've leaned real hard into time loops because they just resonate with us so much, and this is why it's such a human experience and such a deeply unpleasant and like antithetical thought to our beings, this idea of just doing the same thing over and over again with nothing ever changing.
And it's such a believable human experience and feeling that's being pulled from one of the least human, and as far as we know right now, at least real, like of all genres. Few things are more purely fictional and fantastical for the most part than time travel. And then here's this little subsection of it that's just all too real already.
Yep. I mean, that's sci-fi is at its best when it is a human story and it's dealing with human problems, right? It doesn't matter how grand your setting is. If you're dealing with exploding planets and intergalactic empires, time travel, you know, toying around with black holes like gods, it doesn't matter how cool or crazy your world is or your plot is. I've said it before, I'll say it again. If your characters aren't interesting, nobody will care. And that is why sci-fi is at its best when the story is about people and human problems.
At the end of the day, what's gonna keep you anchored both in reality and in the stories you like is the people, because humans are obsessed with relating ourselves to other things, and how are you supposed to feel like something has real weight, real importance if it's completely and utterly detached from you, and there is only so much we can relation we can try to pull from abstract concepts or inanimate objects that have nothing to do with us. In the end, it's people. It's always people.
Yeah. Lightsabers are cool, but that's not why we watch the Star Wars movies, you know?
Lightsabers are cool, but has anybody asked how Anakin feels lately?
If they had, all those children
Maybe
might have survived.
maybe a couple things would have been better if someone had just sat down, had a cup of coffee, and been like, "What's up with you lately, Anakin? You seem stressed."
It's yeah, but it's the same thing. You know, time travel is cool, but Predestination's not an interesting movie because of the. I mean, it contributes, sure, but the thing that makes Predestination so cool as a movie for me is the way that it deals with the character of John. It's his realization that he is the problem, that the thing he has been fighting against the whole time is himself, you know?
That even though he's already convinced himself that certain things have to happen and everything has to be a certain way, he's actually this whole time been even more trapped than he realized by that idea, because that idea has been his very reason for existing, and everything he has ever done or supposedly will do since the moment he was born, and the very people who set him on that path and put him in charge supposedly of making his own destiny happen knew that.
Yeah, in the end of Predestination, he rejects that idea that everything has to happen a certain way, some things are just set in stone. He rejects that idea. He despite everything he said and believed up to that point, when he finds out that he is the Fizzle Bomber, he rejects that notion. He shoots the other him and says, "I'm not gonna be you," and we know from what we've seen, from what the other him says, that's what sets it in stone for him. Like, that's a human
That's how he
drama
became the Fizzle Bomber, is by rejecting the loop he was trapped in.
It's things like that. It is always about people. It's just as you said. It is always about people. Now we are getting close to the end of our runtime here. So as I always do when we do these segments on stories I've written, I think we always do it anyway. I try to. I do like to be fair and open myself to criticism. So any thoughts on the story? Anything you think I should have done differently?
Should have done differently, I'm not sure, because you definitely accomplished the goal you went out to write. So, like, you know, obviously,
It's something that would have made it more enjoyable for you. Even like I'm curious. I mean, if there's nothing, I'll take the win. But
it's hard to think of something, of anything that wouldn't just simply also make it longer, and it was intentionally a short story. But maybe just a couple small things, like little motivations here and there, like maybe Nader thinking about certain small interactions he always has at the office, especially interactions he might have with somebody who's not in the loop, so to speak, and doesn't know what's going on. Little things like that that help him, that are supposed to help him hold on to his sanity, but that maybe he's starting to like grow disdain for, like he is everything else. But at the same time, he would miss it if it stopped.
Yeah, so like just like something to show like what motivated him to begin with, and then how distant he's
That
become
and
with
like,
that motivation.
and in a way, some of the small things he's been fighting for this whole time. Like
Yeah,
what?
my only qualm with that is then it would be harder to justify him giving up in the end. But I mean, you can write your way around any problem if you think about it, so it's valid.
Well, I like the idea that a couple little things like that, things that people generally wouldn't care about, might be some of the very things he thinks about right as he's giving up, or as he's trying to convince himself not to give up, or even just could pop up when he gives up. Like, finds himself thinking about that for a moment, still decides it's not worth it, and essentially says, "Sorry, guys," and drives away.
Fair. That could have added some weight to it. Yeah.
Because it's, if that's the very same stuff he motivated himself with, he's probably gonna remind himself at that last second that that's something he's giving up and letting go of. I'm gonna have to be like, yeah, but it is what it is. Time to go home.
That is fair. See, when I wrote the story, right, I very intentionally wanted him to be the only character we really interact with as the audience, right? Because I wanted to emphasize how isolated he was. Like, the closest he comes to interacting with other human beings in that story is either being stuck in traffic or seeing other people on their own balconies, which are very intentionally little worlds completely separate from his own. So I wanted to lean into that idea of how isolated he was and why, and how that's contributed to his problem, the lack of other people in his life, his lack of a support network.
He's already in an isolation bubble.
Exactly. But what you say isn't wrong either. Like, it potentially, I don't know if it would have, it might have. It's definitely worth considering that maybe if he had had something like that to reflect on, even, it could have made that contrast stronger.
Little things like that are the only way I could possibly think of to improve it. Because there's a short story, it's a project, it's enjoyable for how long it lasts, and like, one thing I can't explicitly think to improve on unless I wanted to maybe try really hard to analyze the whole thing for a long time is it accomplishes very clearly the goal it was set out to do.
Hey, we take those.
So it's only the little tiny details here and there that we could possibly make better, and I don't know if I can think of a story where that's not true. I rarely think about it in the moment while I'm reading good stories, because I think there's a small part of my brain that, unless something particularly itches at me, just wants to be into it anyways, and is gonna not even let me perceive a lot of those small imperfections.
I'm not saying this was one of those ties, but sometimes as well, those things are just personal preference. Like, you have a thing that comes up to you, and you're like, I get why you did this.
Yeah.
But I might have liked it more for me with this in it. And when you get to those finer, like, those little details, like, I think that's when that starts coming into play. When it's like big things, that's when you know it's a quality issue.
Yeah, exactly. It's something you could change. That doesn't mean you should. But that's really it. I liked it. It's a nice little short story.
Oh, nice.
I don't have anything to criticize. It's really nice. Nader had his coffee. Maybe everything would have been fine if he had a cat. Maybe if he had a cat, he could have kept motivated.
Honestly, it probably would have helped, because it would have been just another life interacting with him in a positive way that he could lean on as support, you know?
It's a sad thing he didn't think about that. Or maybe he did and he told himself he doesn't like animals or something. We don't know exactly fully what kind of person Nader was before all this, but he was he was a big, mildly social but not super social science nerd. We know that much. So maybe he never wanted a pet, but it definitely helps in a situation like this.
Yeah. You heard it here, folks. If you run into a problem, get a cat. It won't solve any of them. It will probably create more for you, but you will love it anyway.
You will, the pets will give you dopamine.
Dopamine, good.
Dopamine.
That's how very cold take for this episode.
It's this is a very, human do dopamine feel good, like feel good.
Yeah, anyway, we can wrap that up there. I think we got a good amount out of this one. I'm glad you liked the story.
I did.
I'm glad I wrote a time travel story and didn't fuck it up because it's really hard to do.
Hey, it's like we were talking about with loops earlier. The tighter it is, and the less you have to go through, the better your odds of not falling into one of the many potholes that fill the road of time travel.
True. All right, so if you guys out there are listening to this on Spotify or Google Podcasts, you can also find these episodes on my website, radfordwrites.com, where you will also find the transcripts for these stories, as well as some other stuff I write. I do like blog posts and articles there now as well, and sprinkle in some other little things every now and then you can take a look at. You could also find links there to Amazon where you can buy my books, or you could check me out on what is left of Twitter, if that's still there when this episode airs, at Daniel Wright 7. And I'm also on Blue Sky now. I don't know how much use I'll actually get out of it, but I'm Radford Wrights there.
Look at that, Mr. Blue Sky over here.
Ah, God. Goodbye.
Have fun, everybody, and don't let yourself get stuck in a rut or a loop.